Okay, I think, yeah, we are on. Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to those of you who are here in person and those of you who are online. This session is about models of collaboration. My name is Sarah West. I'm the Director of External Affairs at Hospice UK, and I'm going to be your chair for this session. I'm going to just do a few housekeeping things before I introduce our speakers. If you're watching online, please put your questions into the Q&A box underneath the live stream. And for those of you in Liverpool, you'll start to know the drill now. If you could use the Slido, which you'll see up on the screen, just please, as we go through, put your questions onto that. What we'll do is we'll hear from our speakers first, and then we'll have some time to be able to address some of those questions and hear from them. The session is recorded, and that will be available in 10 days after the conference, and you can find the details of where you can see those films and the session recordings from your brochures. Can you please turn your phones to silent? And on that note, we've finished with housekeeping. So I really would love to ask you to join me in welcoming our colleagues from 2 hospices in New Zealand. So we've gone global, and to hear how regional collaborations between the hospices are working there, what aspects of work could translate, we could learn from, and use in the UK as well. So we've got Tony Gray, who is our Chief Executive of Nelson Tasman Hospice from New Zealand, and Tina McCafferty, who is the Chief Executive of Totara Hospice, and they will be speaking first. But we'll also be hearing from colleagues for the West Yorkshire and Harrogate Hospice Collaborative on how they came together and the benefits it has for their region. And so I welcome Michael Crowther, who's Chief Executive of the Kirkwood, and Victoria Wharton, who is Interim Associate Director of Strategic Partnerships and Services in the North East and Yorkshire for Curie. So you're all very welcome. Thank you for giving your time. And we're really looking forward to hearing what you want to share with us this afternoon. So I think I'm going to leave it there, and I'm going to leave it to our speakers to just start telling us a bit more about collaboration. Thank you.
Ena mana ena reo eta iwi tena tātou katoa. Tina and I are just going to do a bit of a double act, and whilst we are chief executives of 2 separate hospices in New Zealand, the collaboration that we want to talk to you about is to do with something called the Equity and Sustainability Pathway Group that you can see in this logo, a group that was set up and mandated by the hospice sector for 2 reasons, really. First of all, to respond to the health reforms in New Zealand, which started in 2021. You'll hear the terms Te Whatu Ora and Te Aka Whai Ora a few times. Te Whatu Ora is Health New Zealand, and Te Aka Whai Ora is the Māori Health Authority, Māori being the indigenous peoples of New Zealand, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we work our way through. The group is made up of the 4 regional health areas. So New Zealand at one point in time had 22 district health boards. The reforms brought that down to a centralised approach with 4 regions. Those 4 regions I'll show you in just a minute. And the role of this group is to design an equitable, sustainable model and a national funding model for the hospice sector, along with some other things which we'll talk about as we make our way through. So just to start with, just a bit of a snapshot around hospices in New Zealand. I'm not going to read them all, but just perhaps some of the key elements. What you're going to glean from this, I think, as much as anything, is first of all, we're no different from you and you are no different from us. From what we can see in terms of what we've read and what we've heard already in this conference, everybody is facing the same challenges, dealing with them in different but the same ways. So there are 29 Crown-funded hospices in New Zealand, and those hospices provide the largest amount of specialist palliative care for the country. We look after about 35% of dying New Zealanders, and about 35% of our patients are suffering from non-malignant illnesses. 80% of our services are provided in the community. Hospices range from having inpatient units to just providing community. Some provide inpatient units and community. Interestingly, when we told Te Whatu Ora, the Health New Zealand, this just a couple of months ago, they were amazed at the amount of provision that's delivered in the community by hospices. And then those other background areas, the one that's quite interesting, which this group that we're involved with are looking to provide more and more data on, is what that value add cost to the health sector is for what hospices do. And that middle bullet point, estimate of integrated home-based palliative care, what it saves the New Zealand health system, is extrapolated from a KPMG paper that was written for Australia, and then New Zealand figures applied to it. Like you, we rely heavily on volunteers. We have across the country about 10,000 volunteers, and the Crown funds at the moment at about 92 million, less than 50% of the total cost of delivery. We gather from what we've heard, come closer. We gather from what we've heard that in some cases we're probably lucky actually in comparison to some hospices in this in the UK. So the New Zealand made up, as you know, of a relatively small population, but a very large landmass, or a large landmass in comparison to the UK, geographically bigger. And the four regions run basically from, is this working? Yeah. Auckland and Northland, Auckland being the largest population. So the North region, and then Te Manawataki, which is the Waikato region that straddles from the west coast across to the east coast, the Bay of Plenty. The Central region, which takes up all of Wellington, and this area through here in the middle. And then the fourth region is the whole of the South Island. The reason for really providing that as information is that the approach that the reforms are taking us down is to look at everything on a regional basis, including the introduction of commissioning on a regional basis. So not on an individual hospice basis, but on a regional basis. And Tina will talk a little bit about that in a second. So the challenges and the opportunities, I've mentioned the size of the country from a geographical point of view, the population. An important point to mention in terms of the collaboration and how this is unfolding, and the fact that the group that we have is called the Equity and Sustainability Group, is that the Treaty of Waitangi, Te Tiriti, is enshrined in the Constitution of New Zealand. And of course that represents the context of Māori, and in terms of our challenges equity-wise, they're not only challenges from a Māori point of view, but also from a Pacifica point of view, and then from a growing immigrant population and diverse population and diversity in itself. Again, I won't read through all these. Auckland has the greatest level of diversity, but the rest of the country is growing up. I would say that probably Te Waipunamu, the South Island, is probably a little bit behind the North Island on that. Huge issues around rurality and accessing patients accessing hospice services from a rural perspective. And that clearly, on top of the Indigenous element of equity and the other diversity elements of equity, is also a really big issue in the context of collaboration going forward for this group. And then the only other thing is that we don't have any national funding formula. So I've only been in the sector for just under 2 years, but I use this as an inaccurate but a useful example. You can be offering 80% of core services to patients and only get 50% funding from government. You can be offering 50% of core services and get 70 to 80% core funding. So there's no consistency at all across what hospices are funded. We've heard on a number of occasions today, and certainly in the room just previously, one of the big issues for us around the reasons for doing this collaboration is that there are a number of hospices that are purely not sustainable for the future. And the context of the work around the Equity and Sustainability Group is to try and find a model that can at least allow for hospices to be able to provide services. And again, Tina will talk a little bit about that. And again, we've heard since we've been here, is that we have a huge community support. We get no funding at all for capital. All the capital funding, plus about 50% of our core service costs, come from donations and bequests and shops and so on. So really, I just wanted to give you a bit of insight into then where we have been and what we are still working through in terms of what we're dealing with, and in particular, I think it would be fair to say that when this group got underway, we were faced with a sector that was fragmented. It certainly had lots of inequalities. It was very inconsistent in terms of what it offers, and also patient access. And at the same time, it was working alongside an overall health system which, put here, was collapsing under demand, probably not as stretched as the NHS, but certainly Te Whatu Ora, Health New Zealand, is taking on a sizable set of issues. And our opportunity in this group, in our collaboration, is to try and respond to those things and provide an opportunity to take the hospice sector forward. So the only other thing I would say is my first meeting when I went to meet with all my chief executive hospice colleagues back in May 2022, the interim chief executive of the of Health New Zealand, of Te Whatu Ora, stood up and said, well, one of the things you need to be ready for in the reforms is to choose which ones of you are going to close. And again, that was the catalyst for us saying we need to collaborate to do much more in this place. We're still at the beginning of this, and what Tina's going to tell you about shows a little bit of history as well as where we're going forward. And in some cases, we're behind you. We've got lots to learn still about things like commissioning, but in other areas, the collaborations are coming together. And I'll hand over to Tina.
Kia ora tōne. Ina mana ina reo hira karangatanga maha ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you very much for the invite to speak today. If a Glaswegian and a man from Cornwall speaking today o Māori to an audience in Liverpool doesn't waken you up, that's what we should be doing. We should be awake because, as we heard today from Toby so eloquently, and terrifyingly, the very future of hospice is very much on the precipice, not just in England, Wales, Scotland and around, but in New Zealand too. We have very similar health and social systems. We have a similar system of government, and we have a similar invisibility outside of government crisis to have a place at the table. So the coming together of the equity and sustainability collaboration, I've just realised I'm not tall enough to see the screen. That's what you get for being a spout. The equity and sustainability collaboration was really about responding to the fact that hospices needed to have a place at the table together, that we were aware that continuing to strategically respond to system crisis with "we've not got enough money, what are you going to do about it?" was just something that government didn't want to hear. Us and every other part of the sector, right? General practice, hospitals, mental health, addictions. And so we really wanted to come together with how can we collaborate around a solution? And do we have any examples of strong alliances across our sector that can allow us to build on a solution? The slide that Tony had up earlier, you may very well recognise some of your own system sector behaviour in that. Right? Some of our greatest strengths is that we're born out of our communities. Like anything else, our greatest strength can be our greatest weakness. And that often means we set up for ourselves almost a competitive internal market about whose population is who, whose staff are who, whose relationships are whose bigger, who's medium-sized, who's smaller. It's not helpful. So what we really realised that between a third to two-thirds of hospices in New Zealand were going to close between 36 to 60 months if we just didn't do something different. So our response was the Equity and Sustainability Pathway Group. What have we been doing? So we came together to look at, within those 4 regions, in the reality that there is no national specification for palliative care, hospice care in New Zealand, and that 21 from 22 government agencies were using a population-based formula that had very little equity adjusters in it, and then could sprinkle in whatever funding they wanted to for their area. What Tony's alluded to is you can have 80% of core services for 50% of funding or reverse. We wanted to bring a solution that said, we want to show you how we will alliance, collaborate together. We want to do that based on 100% fair, transparent funding under an equitable funding formula where there was a consistent minimum of services that were available for every dying person who needed it within each region. We wanted to be transparent and accountable to ourselves, to our community, who are actually funders 1B, as well as government, who are funders 1A. And we wanted to agree with our peak body Hospice New Zealand, with our multidisciplinary clinical teams, what those core services would be. So we set off on an alliance model. What does that mean? It means that we agreed to work together, that we would use a formal charter that was signed off by our chief executives and boards, which was endorsed by our clinical leadership groups, about how we would work as numbers of hospices within each region, and those things that we agreed to work on. What was really important within those charters is knowing what's out of them as well as what's in them. Because it's not about every single thing that you do. It's about the things that you do better together to get equity of impact for your population. And secondly, out of equity of impact, how do you get efficiencies and economies of scale and innovation transfer? We had a model that we had used for 6 or 7 years across the Auckland region. It was known as the POI Collaborative. A POI in New Zealand historically is a weapon, but also an instrument of training where you have to work that instrument in rhythm within a group in order to get the motion that you want. And so we came together in a POI collaborative where it was better community care together. And we decided that we would work with aged residential care partners and primary care partners to support a palliative care approach across the community, where registers of palliative need could be stratified within rest homes and within general practice. We decided that we would have a single employee and we would run a regional multidisciplinary clinical leadership group, that we would take a hospice private partnership across a new data framework and develop a data dashboard, including equity heat maps for areas of high need and high poverty, and we would set ourselves transparent targets. 6 to 7 years on now, we now know that 80 to 84% of patients with palliative need in the community who work within POI no longer use ambulance, secondary care or emergency departments in their last couple of months of life. And we know that that's economically and socially really significant. So how did we take something that 5 hospices did together and use that as an endorsed blueprint for how a country of hospices would work together? So the Equity and Sustainability Group's first task was to introduce that, which we've done. And all of the 4 regions have signed their charters from each organisation across work to close the gaps for need within the community. We also knew that if we wanted to sit at the table with government, then data and transparency of data was going to be really important. So we put in motion what was called a hospice service variation and costing model. That allowed the 29 hospices across the country to release their data in confidence. That was their financial data, their activity data, their components of care, what it cost them every year to run, how much funding they got. And it allowed us to do an analysis up and down the country. And what we found from that was that over 60% of hospices didn't have a contract for more than 18 months. And there was not one contract that was purchased with the same components around it. So this was really important information, and we're now at the stage of beginning to put together what does 100% funding for core equitable services across 4 regions look like. The monitoring framework, we wanted to produce a dashboard. We wanted to get permission from all partners in this partnership with Hospice New Zealand to be able to look at what is it that we want to be able to publish. So looking at a selection of both Peacock and Oak, and also Mark Friedman's results-based accountability, to be able to really to look at how much have we done, how well have we done it, how do we know it, and who's better off, and based on what lenses. And then with that, put together those core services agreements. We also felt that it was really necessary for the group to build, as Tony would call, a manual. Right? We weren't there with a Bible trying to tell all these independent organisations what to do, but we were there with a mandate. And the mandate was around collaborating with capability and capacity to build a manual on how to sit at the table, understand and negotiate with regional commissioners. And that started with what is Commissioning 101. You guys are a few years ahead of New Zealand in that, and in some ways New Zealand is back to the future, where in 1998 when I landed there they had just disestablished the regional health funding authorities, so there's never anything new under the sun. But putting together that manual, we also got a mandate to work with government on national pay parity. So the collaboration became really, really important, because government was really clear. We are not going to negotiate with 29 hospices. We don't want to hear 29 hospices, we want a voice. So that became a critical table, and that's become pay parity at this point, pay parity for nursing in New Zealand under the term a contribution to nursing equity. Most hospices now, however, as an outcome of that, are at 95 to 100% of their salaries for nursing, matching what the government pays itself in its own hospitals for their nursing. So that's been significant progress of that collaboration. Also to do joint sector communications and to be the forum, and I'm going to keep saying this, in partnership with Hospice New Zealand, to be the forum where officials from Te Whatu Ora come to sit at the table to discuss how we might make a national specification that is nationally endorsed, regionally commissioned, locally implemented at a fair, equitable and sustainable price under the intention of the health reforms in New Zealand, which are really to say that hospice services are involved in a context of equity. So what we're saying is that no patient with need should be in the situation of access only being enabled via their postcode, depending on where they live, but also importantly, that when each patient receives hospice care, they should do so in a way that's culturally competent by all staff and received and experienced as being culturally safe, defined by those who receive it. So in South Auckland, where I work, where there's over 100, I think it's 111 different cultural groups and ethnicities, multitude of language within the context of a treaty. So being able to close the gap around inequities due to structural racism or unconscious bias or has become critically important and part of work for the Alliance. So what that looks like, just to put all of that information together, this is the kind of, I guess, diagrammatic or informatic that we have endorsed by our sector and that we use with government. The group now is about 14 months old, and we have more traction as a sector than we've done for probably 20 or 25 years. And it's absolutely necessary because our scope is small, but our reach is deep. And we need to be able to get to the table as we are and say, we have a solution for chronic disease at end of life. We have a solution for neurological disease at end of life and metastatic disease at end of life and for assisted death at end of life. And we want to bring that to you in a way that's mandated by an entire sector. And that's proven quite powerful. So I'll leave it at that. Ngā mihi kia koutou and happy to take questions later. Kia ora.
Thank you. Thank you both very much indeed. We'll have questions at the end. Please do sort of use the Slido and make sure that we get those questions coming in. That was very insightful. Thank you both. And now I'd like to introduce Michael Crowther and Victoria Wharton, and you're going to talk to us about the North Eastern Hospice partnership, the strategic partnership.
So hello everyone, I'm Michael. I'm Chief Executive of an organisation called the Kirkwood Support Life. We're an adult hospice provider in a place called Kirklees in West Yorkshire. And we're just one of the partners of 10 hospices that form the West Yorkshire Hospice Collaborative.
And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Victoria. I'm the Interim Associate Director for Curie, covering the North Eastern Yorkshire. And the hospice that relates to this collaboration is the Curie Hospice within Bradford.
So we're really pleased to be able to to have the opportunity to talk about our story of collaboration, and there's lots that resonate with colleagues in New Zealand and what we just heard. You'll all have your own experiences of collaboration, so this is just one story. But I think the place I would start is to say that in West Yorkshire, we represent all hospice provision for the population in West Yorkshire. So there are only 10 hospices, and the 10 hospices are included within the collaboration, have been from the start and are up until the present day. Through some quite challenging times, I think you'll all agree the last few years haven't been just a walk in the park. But the other thing that's happened in that time is that 8 out of those 10 organisations have had a change in leadership during that period as well. So, but equally, the collaboration has managed to continue to include all organisations. So just to give you an idea of the kind of scale and scope of what we're talking about. So each of our charities are really quite significant in the places for the populations we serve. But when we stand together alongside each other, we become something even more significant for the population of West Yorkshire. So these figures are actually a little bit out of date now, but if I bring it up to date, we collectively represent a turnover of over £60 million, of which over £40 million is invested in our expert clinical services locally. Collectively, we employ well over 1,600 people, and a good proportion of those, probably the largest proportion of those, live within the local area. And we're responsible for mobilising nearly 5,000 volunteers. And then the upshot of all of this is that there are nearly 17,000 people, service users, patients and family members, who benefit from the services that we provide locally. So, prior to the pandemic, collaboration was a thing. There's plenty of thought leaders, particularly in the hospice sector and in health and social care, and maybe outside of that, that we're seeing collaboration as necessary for meeting the needs of our population, but also sustaining our services well into the future. But it has to be said, even though there were conversations between individual organisations and groups of organisations within our local area and nationwide, meaningful collaboration in West Yorkshire hadn't happened, and in particular, not that included all hospice provision. So it took the pandemic to actually force that change and force a different conversation, as it forced us to do all kinds of things differently within our operating models.
So just to illustrate the process that the collaborative went through and the evolution of the group, I'm going to try and do something a little bit clever. I hope it works. We referred to 3 models that most of you will be familiar with. So the first of those is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the first 4 needs of Maslow's model are known as the deficiency needs. So from the baseline of those physiological, psychological needs up to esteem needs. They are the most basic functions that have to be fulfilled and maintained to ensure survival and sustain life. And obviously Maslow intended those foundation levels to be applied to human life, so food, air, water, shelter. But in the context of a group or team or collaborative, they can actually be used really nicely, as we will try to explain as we go through the next few slides. And the top of the triangle, we have missed out a few of the growth elements just for conciseness, but that demonstrates where we aim to be as a group, not merely surviving, but thriving. The second model that we are going to refer to is a model by Patrick Lencioni, which first appeared in around 2002. He's an American management consultant, and he published a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. And like Maslow, the premise is that in order for a team to be truly successful, all of these elements need to be in place. And the third model is, some of you may be familiar with Simon Sinek, who again is a coach, he's a management consultant, but he talks about the why. So he uses a model called the Golden Circle, and the premise is that it's so important to always connect to the why and to be really clear about what your why is. And that as a team, we can achieve so much more if we understand what our compelling why is and use that as a basis for then defining our what and our how. And it's really important to say that actually this process is never, and certainly hasn't been, a linear process. And as people have joined the collaborative and left, and as different challenges have been faced, we've moved up and down there as the landscape has changed. So when the original collaborative came together back in 2020, I think the why was pretty clear. There was a new and terrifying pandemic. It was causing a huge amount of fear and uncertainty, and it felt necessary to be together to survive. And what the collaborative did was they were really stuck on ensuring visibility and equity and inclusion in that system COVID response. And some of the ways they did that were weekly sit reps, stakeholder comms, distribution of resources, including PPE, but not limited to. And when extra money did become available, made sure there was a fair distribution of that funding.
So you'll get familiar with this concept of the why. So, you know, I'll spoiler alert. Basically, it's all about keeping your eye on the why all the way through. So we came through the pandemic and all the trauma and complexity that that had. But we entered a world that was equally complex. And I suppose as we use these models to sort of almost move through our evolution and development, the next priority for us became, you know, being safe as individual organisations and as a collaborative. And in Lencioni's model, what he says, you can't develop commitment in a team or an organisation until you've experienced some level of conflict. So the ideas about exactly where the collaborative should focus its energies, you know, were probably many, and they focused on, I suppose, the challenges that we had and have. So challenges in terms of the workforce, you know, workforce availability and capability became an issue and is going to be an issue for us going into the future. The impact of the cost of living crisis on both expenditure and income was really challenging our existing organisational models. Then when you think about health inequalities, COVID had really shone a light on health inequalities, and that was absolutely about hospice services as it was about other services in health and social care. And we're experiencing increases in demand. So this is not just the quantum of people that require our services, but the complexity of the needs that are being presented to our services. But at the same time, the health and social care sector was changing. So what we had was integrated care boards that were being established within our integrated care systems. The dissolution of CCGs was on the horizon, and an increasing push within the system for more integrated approaches to health and social care. So within this level of our evolution, it became even more important to keep focused on the why.
So by mid to late 2021, there'd been quite a few iterations of the group, as Michael said, with a fair few of the leads changing. I was a late entry in September 2021. But the relationship did continue, and a lot of progress had been made in terms of the identity of the collaboration. It was really clear that there was a real commitment from all members to bringing together shared expertise and building the profile of the hospices within the ICBs, and really working to demonstrate the true value of the services that we deliver across the health and social care landscape. Ultimately, however, the collaborative were focused on long-term sustainability and, like I said before, not just surviving but thriving. And the principles which guided our ongoing collaboration were aligned, fortunately, to those outlined in the NHS document published in August 2021, Working Together at Scale. And although it hasn't always been easy, these supported us to feel safe, sharing more sensitive information, and being generous with our ideas and resources, and overall reinforcing that feeling of togetherness.
Okay, so why now? We've had to go through a process and sort of boil down exactly why we exist and what our mission is. And I suppose in Maslow terms, it's where as partners we find belonging and love within the partnership. But in Lencioni's terms, again, what we can't achieve is accountability before there's commitment. So we had to arrive at a single mission that we were all bought into and focused on. And that really was about the changes in the health and social care system that we've described. More important than ever was our need to have an identity within that system, to have a voice so that we could influence and take some kind of control over our own destiny. So we became recognised within West Yorkshire Health and Social Care System as a provider collaborative of hospices. And then very soon we were actually invited into the membership of the ICS and had a seat on what's called the System Leadership Executive Group. And I represent the West Yorkshire Hospices within that group. And we had to, I suppose, focus on making sure that we were adding value to the integrated care system by aligning what we were doing with what they called their 10 big obsessions. So just to give you an example, one of those obsessions is health inequalities, and there was a campaign called Root Out Racism. Another obsession is around tackling climate change, and there's a campaign called All Hands In. And as hospices, we aligned ourselves behind those campaigns to show support to the system. But the payback for us was at least a stated commitment to help us look at our financial sustainability in the future. So we're not taking our eye off other opportunities to work at scale or to share resources, but we have boiled it down to this sort of single mission as it stands. And in terms of how we do this, we're not going to sort of take away our ethos and our identity and our ability to be disruptive. Again, as hospices, and the hospice movement's always been disruptive, but to think more creatively about our alliances and collaboration. Like I said before, you know, we represent all hospice provision, adult hospices, independent and national charities, children and young people's hospices. And there's plenty within that to think about. But together we're stronger. All of that diversity in our personality and identity gives us a stronger voice within our system. But in terms of evolution, this is not going to work unless we get some good stuff along the way. So again, in Maslow terms, it's where we start to get self-esteem. In Lencioni's terms, you can't achieve results until you've got accountability. So I'm not going to pretend that this was an easy ride, because it was far from it. And we still got bumps in the road that we have to navigate and negotiate. But each one of the partners has taken their turn in actually taking the baton and being a leader on certain things, which has sustained our momentum. But we also needed some wins, and we've been really lucky that there's been regular wins throughout our journey over the last three and a bit years to keep us motivated and to keep us focused on the end goal. So it started actually with something that predated the actual formal collaboration. So we successfully, quickly distributed the £2 million that's made available in West Yorkshire of the £25 million that was for palliative care back in December 2019. We were formally invited onto the Integrated Care System Leadership Executive, like I said, in November 2020. And then in the following July, we had approved two things. One was the idea that we would lead the development of a manifesto for palliative and end-of-life care in West Yorkshire. And the second was the commitment of the system to work on sustainable funding for hospices. We consolidated our identity within the ICS web presence. We had our own dedicated web page. We also created blogs which were circulated and shared with all of our partners, advocating for the work that we do. We secured funding to support the development of the collaborative, and that might not seem like a lot of money, but actually was really instrumental in us being able to have resources that were outside of our day job resources. Moving on, a really significant milestone in September 2022 when the ICS published their palliative and end-of-life care strategy in response to the Health and Care Bill. It had an explicit commitment to work on fair and sustainable funding for hospices. We're still working on this. But in March of this year, we were awarded another lump of 1.8 million non-recurrent funding, which again we distributed effectively throughout partners. And then in May, we launched our manifesto, and that was a platform to engage the wider partnership in the work that we'll do together to bring about some of the objectives of the palliative end-of-life care strategy. And as we're talking to you here today, we're at a really critical point. So we're just about to land a really key paper around future funding requirements for the hospices in West Yorkshire. And that's been a result of a lot of hard work with everybody involved. So I suppose what I'm saying is our core mission, that ball is still in play. The ball of financial sustainability, which hopefully will land in December of this year. We've got a commitment to at least consider a deal on future funding by December of this year.
Thanks, Michael. So I think Michael's done a really good job of bringing us right up to date in our journey, and the ultimate why of the collaboration, the reason we've all continued with our involvement, is equitable and sustainable end-of-life care, and it's when it's needed, where it's needed, and how it's needed. And I'm sure everyone in the room knows that in order for this to be achieved, there are many whats and probably even more hows to be realised. But for the purposes of time and finishing today, we've chosen a few that are really key and really important to us. And linking this back to where we started, I think we can see that in order to achieve our ultimate why, the collaborative must remain laser-focused on the why and avoid any individualistic behaviour where personal interest can take over the needs of the collective. And Lencioni actually draws the comparison with marriage, and he says, however much we want to work together, becoming and remaining a team requires dedication and discipline. It is just like a good marriage. A marriage is not just positive by itself. You have to constantly work for it. And individuals need to leave their egos at the door and realise that the journey is just as important as the final destination. So in summary, collaboration may be born out of a basic need for survival as well as a deliberate and conscious effort. It takes time, commitment, and a great deal of trust by all involved. The basic needs of the respective team members and their organisations need to be met before true accountability and progress towards goals can be achieved. And recognising and acknowledging where people are in that process really supports the engagement and their ongoing commitment. The process definitely isn't a linear one, and there are many challenges along the way and many setbacks. But each win along the way renews the energy, the drive and the passion for the collaboration. And I know we keep saying it, but identifying and revisiting that why all of the time is a real motivator and driver of change. And ultimately, the outputs of a mature, well-functioning collaborative are multifactorial and impact the system, the organisation and the people that we are here to serve. Thank you.
Thank you both very much. That was fascinating, and I think this is a really interesting example of both the similarities really that exist across the hospice sector, even across our world actually. I wanted to start, we've got some great questions coming in, please keep those flowing through. But I wanted to start while you both sets have talked about your collaborations. I'm interested to know how you evaluate and measure the success of those collaborations. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that to sort of explain where you've got and how you look at it and go, yeah, that's definitely been successful. Did you set key performance indicators at the beginning, or how did you go about doing it? I don't know which of you would like to kick off.
We could go first, I think.
Yeah,
I suppose we had some of that in the presentation, didn't we? Which was almost like what the wins have been along the way. I think it would be disingenuous to say that we set out with measures, but actually some of these wins have been really critical. Like we said, in sort of keeping that motivation and that focus for the collaboration. But I suppose the other thing that I suppose you know when you've arrived is when people start talking about it as a thing, not just you. So we know because of things that our colleagues in our system have published and have written about, that they recognise us as as one voice, as an entity. So I would take that as a measure of success too.
Fantastic. Did you want to add?
No, I would agree. It's just, it would have been lovely to set out with those KPIs at the start, but I think because of the way the group came together initially, it wasn't necessarily a conscious thing at first. And I think it's only through the evolution and the maturity and the trust that's grown that we've actually been able to have those really honest conversations and say, where are you at and where do you want to be? And actually as a collective, is that what we want to do as a group? And like I did mention, some egos or some preciousness has to be put to one side for the greater good. And I think that's the point where we're at now, which is really positive.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we would say exactly the same. I think no specific KPIs in the equity and sustainability group work, but what we're starting to see is a bit of trust. Some transparency. So when we started, nobody would share data with anybody else. Everything was anonymized. Everything that you saw was seen as being in the eyes of the individual hospice, how they were performing, rather than seeing it as simply a benchmark as to, well, what does this mean in comparison? So no specific KPIs, but some tangible outcomes that are starting to come together.
I would just add to that we probably did have one big KPI, but we didn't really articulate it as such, and it was just to survive. Yeah. And that's really interesting, thriving and not just surviving, because it was certainly around survival. Just in contrast to that, because there was a different subpopulation within the POI programme, we did set explicit KPIs as a chartered alliance, and those were really a mixture of activity and impact indicators. So, for example, how many proactive palliative care action plans had gone through the touch points of the services, how many free specialist palliative care consultations and clinical coaching and support sessions and service development had there been, and then impact. How many of the patients who were in POI used any other part of the health system and why? How long, if at all, between being in generous palliative care was the journey to specialist palliative care, and what was the patient experience of it? And we do collect and publish that data. So just a bit of a mix.
Thank you very much. So turning to Slido, both parties have talked about the importance of trust and that building of trust. If we sort of unpack that a little bit, there are obvious tensions when you come to the table like this, and you've both talked about that. How did you go about agreeing to get people to work together for the greater good? I mean, you've talked about that kind of sense of like gatekeeping. It's very natural, isn't it? Can you tell us a little bit about how did you manage to engender that trust that people felt they could put their own individual hospice agenda aside? Would you like to start?
So I think, like we tried to describe, it's a process, isn't it? And it's how I mean, I'm not going to go down the marriage route, the marriage route, but it's how relationships develop. And I suppose it's feeling safe when you disagree, that there are not consequences, that people aren't going to, fall out, that it's okay to disagree. I suppose one of the things we had quite early on was a collaborative agreement that, again, we'd taken our organisations, our boards through, so we were signed up to some high-level principles rather than sort of our organisational specific objectives. And something about continuing to revisit that, but learning through disagreement that you can trust that's contained within the collaborative, and it's not making anybody more vulnerable.
Anything to add?
Again, would agree entirely. I think one of the challenges that we find probably with trust is that, and I probably need to be a bit careful about how I say this, but some of the biggest challenges is as much with boards as it is with management teams and individual hospices. And for us as well, I think it's about trying to bring both the governance element of what we're doing along with also the operational leadership and management as well, because those close connections to communities in particular, really easy to undermine that opportunity to collaborate more.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just add, I think, within the 4 regions for us, it was really important that the hospice membership within the 4 regions could elect their representatives. But at the other side of that coin, it was equally, if not more important, for those who were voting to understand that each member was not there to necessarily represent a region first and foremost. They were there to represent that palliative care, hospice care should be visible, valued, accessible and equitably available across New Zealand for all who needed it. And so keeping the main goal as the main goal was really, really important. And then secondly, realising that you never get everyone to trust you all at the same time, all the time ever. And that's just a reality. So being really, really transparent, communicating a lot, challenging constructively misinterpretation, and then really just as we say, if certain organisations, leadership teams or boards want to go a different direction, there's no impediment to sovereignty. And being really clear that there's no impediment to sovereignty as long as the accountability that don't change, survival's not mandatory, is also equally understood.
Great, thank you. And changing tack just slightly, and maybe thinking about collaboration as something that affects, ultimately we have a goal, we want to achieve better care for all the patients that you see. Can you tell us a little bit about what difference does a collaborative make to people's day-to-day work in their hospices? Are there any practical differences that you noted in terms of working practice, or is it really only something that sort of sits at that senior level and that sort of more sort of strategic? Is there anything that you saw filter through as a result of that collaborative?
I'll go first on that then. Certainly, we tangibly care more about each other at every level, and I think although that may seem a little bit twee, it's actually really important. This work's really hard, and we've gone from being a bunch of clinical teams and a bunch of CEOs who met to meet around a common enemy, who now phone each other, work together, design programmes together, and talk a lot. And that's really important. And then right at the clinical level, particularly with the regional alliance, we have people to come in together for 2 hours every 2 or 3 weeks, and that includes multidisciplinary regional clinical groups of social work, medicine, nursing, OT, spiritual care, cultural liaison, and that's sustained. And that leads to better conversations about outcomes and a much greater willingness to lend a hand to each other because it's really hard to say no when you've got a relationship, right?
Brilliant, thank you. Anybody else?
Yeah, I can come in on that one. So I think being part of the collaborative definitely breaks down some organisational and cultural barriers that we have across our system. Really nice examples of that. The hospice I represent, we had to close our inpatient beds for several months because of recruitment issues. And, you know, it was horrendous. But what we were able to do was support one of the other hospices within the collaborative to maintain their bed status. And I think historically that wouldn't have happened. It would have been a very separate, two hospices would have really struggled. And, you know, it felt strange and it felt a bit unusual. But because I think there was, again, we were focused on the why. So it was, why do we do what we do and why would we not do this? So we had to jump through a few hoops and, you know, there was a few processes to navigate, but we did it and it was really successful. And it's certainly something we would never rule out doing again if the need was there. I think that was really powerful. And another example is, you know, working with the Director of Clinical Care in the hospice that Michael oversees to look at what the priorities are for that area, and actually is there a possibility that we could collaborate and we could do something really special together that maybe we couldn't do on our own. So I think that's where it's definitely different on the ground.
I think for me it's sort of in the real why, where we're trying to get to. So I mean, it's great I've forgotten a couple of those examples, Victoria, but you know, because I don't think it's embedded yet. So I would say that the collaboration is probably mostly strategic. Yeah. In terms of differences it's made to people's lives, I think that the chief executives have had a lot more on until we got more resource. But I suppose we believed it was the right thing to do. But to say that I think it's fully owned within our organisations, I think we're way away from that. So colleagues in New Zealand, it sounds like, you know, that, you know, you're further down the road when it comes to things like that. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm going to follow up with a very popular question, because you can tell how many people go, yeah, we love this question. For Yorkshire region, has the word merger ever been mentioned, thinking beyond 5 years, or is this something that maybe is a hurdle? I don't know how you want to respond to that.
Well, I can definitely say the word's never been mentioned,
Okay.
not to my knowledge.
Just take over.
Acquisition.
All right, moving swiftly on. Thank you for that.
It is an interesting one, though, because not only is it highly emotive and all this, but one of the things that we've done is that we've also looked at other sectors where if you don't do it yourselves, you get done too. Mm-hmm. And we've used that as a really strong message and given examples and had that as almost a backdrop to some of the opportunities that we have about doing things now for ourselves and with ourselves.
I think what comes over so clearly in your case is that this was about a fight for survival, wasn't it? And actually, there's a question, isn't there, that is collaboration really, does that really work when you've got such a major problem that you have to come around and because it's not easy, you are forced to start putting your own agendas to one side because you've got a much, much bigger problem. And I think that's a really interesting question for us at the moment across the hospice sector when it comes to thinking about funding and the challenges we've got around workforce. One for another day. Yes. Okay, so I have another question really along those lines of you talked about a lot for your area around the fact that it's probably still sitting at that strategic level, and yet you've talked also about how that has influenced some of the day-to-day practice, and I wondered if any of you wanted to make any comments about how you might have involved or not patients and their families in these collaborations.
When we designed the equity and sustainability pathway, we did two things that will never leave my memory. So we were part of going out in the street and taking people and asking them randomly what's hospice and what does it mean to you. That was organised through Hospice New Zealand and a futurist facilitator called David. And we also asked the same random question of lots of different key stakeholders. So whether that was randomly selected partners in aged care or disability or university students or carers or people who were caring for family members. And the biggest thing that we got back actually was a confusion between hospice and aged residential care was really, really strong from the public, that hospice was only about the last days of care, and that from the Crown side was that hospices were overly expensive, opaque, and basically elite palaces for Europeans to receive care in. So those messages became centrally confronting for us. And then the second one was to take a half day and have current patients and families come to meet with the equity, well, we went to them, but the Equity and Sustainability Group, and asked them what they had experienced and what they wanted from hospice care. And that was in order that that could inform our conversation by keeping patients and patients and families right in the centre of all the conversations, because if you're not prepared to have that conversation with them there, then you should be probably asking yourselves why you're having it. So.
Brilliant. Anybody else on that one?
No, it's a really great opportunity for us. I'm not just going to say these next two words, because that's the title of the conference, but getting people to think differently about hospice care is an opportunity that would bind us all in terms of our success. So it's definitely something we should think about as a collaborative. One thing we have done is within the ICS is to influence work that they've done within their palliative end-of-life care strategy. So there's a report that's just about to be published by Health Watch locally into the experience of bereaved people. And again, that's it was kind of recommended by us, and we've been supporting that work alongside a sort of more comprehensive health needs assessment. But but I would say that's definitely on the pile of opportunities.
Great, thank you. And we're thinking along those lines of that engagement. You talked, Tina, a lot about that idea that people feel very strongly about their local hospice. We know that. And there is often a very emotional response to their local hospices. With these collaboratives and these approaches, have you felt there's been any negative impacts on things like your fundraising or on legacies or anything like that, where you've seen kind of something that maybe you didn't anticipate?
I don't think we've seen it. Well, we've not seen anything negative, but interestingly, I think one of the things that we've been working through is the context of hospices when they're feeling challenged and under pressure with regards to some of the work that we've been doing within the group. Immediately go to the context of language around our community expects and our community knows, and quite often what we found is that actually the community probably only knows what it knows and what it's comparing the services that it gets in comparison to what services other communities get, and trying to bring that together as part of this core service components and other things is really important, in how we communicate that with the community.
Super. Anything else to add?
No, just that it's been our focus. I think we've been really, really clear in the presentation, has been mostly entirely about our identity with health and social care partners at this stage. So we haven't gone beyond that.
Great. Thank you. We haven't got much time left, but there were some interesting questions, I think, for our colleagues from New Zealand, particularly, around the engagement of the Maori communities and how your kind of collaborative approach has evolved and kind of that collaboration what are the issues that you've experienced with that, and have you been able to kind of engage meaningfully and positively, and what outcomes has there been then, if there have been any, for that community?
So in the design of the equity and sustainability pathway, it was really important for us to talk to senior Māori clinicians and or mandated representatives of senior Māori clinicians. We had developed in New Zealand a framework called Māori Mati, which really translates as end of life, which is a framework that was supported by Totara Hospice and Mary Potter Hospice to support and fund the development of an Indigenous end-of-life and palliative care framework for Indigenous communities, so by Māori, for Māori, by Māori clinicians and academics, and that was published in 2020. Part of that was an extensive literature review by Dr. Tess Moeki-Maxwell, who is a very famous, very well-respected researcher amongst many Māori women in New Zealand. Dr. Rawiri Jansen, who leads much of the Māori voice in terms of equity in New Zealand, agreed to come and support the work of the equity and sustainability pathway, and that was through his involvement with Māori Mati. And then we also had the interim chief executive of Te Aka Whaiora, the Māori Health Authority, come and get engaged with us. One of the things that Chad said was, when you do this work, make sure it's bone deep. That was critically important. And then, of course, the hospices who are involved, each of us have a treaty obligation to make sure that our services are culturally responsive to Māori. That happens in a variety of ways and a variety of different competencies. But we have an obligation to be involved with local iwi, tribal groups, Indigenous-based clinics, and also to look at partnerships with Māori service providers. So we really hoped with integrity that we had taken that bicultural partnership view, particularly around equity of outcomes, into the heart of the design. Whether it becomes successful for Māori or not, Māori will tell us based on the outcomes. That looks both at population equity by population presence, but also population equity, importantly, for hospice care and projected number of deaths per region, and then the comparison of Māori access and expected population and expected death.
Wonderful. Thank you. Did you want to add anything at all?
Only that I think the reforms have brought a greater focus on that equity piece when it comes to Māori, and in particular, I think it's important to say it's still very much work in progress. So that whole context of kaupapa Māori, which is doing things in the way that Māori can get themselves involved in, is very much part of the work that we're doing in the equity and sustainability area.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So I'm going to do one more question, a bit more of a sort of wider generic question to finish off with. Could you tell us how you liaise and engage with other health providers that are not necessarily part of that community, that kind of hospice? Do you collaborate with them as a collective, but they're not part of the hospice world? Question?
Sorry,
No,
no,
after you,
no,
please.
I'm sure.
I'll go. So I suppose that's been one of the things in terms of aligning ourselves with the system priorities, that we've been able to interact as a collaboration of hospices with other collaboratives. So we have an acute hospital collaborative, a mental health collaborative, a community services collaborative. So we've been able to interact with those entities more effectively. But we've also been able to support other partners in specific pieces of work. So, for example, a whole focus on supporting discharge from hospital, where partners would come together, you know, in forums, again,
collaborations where all range of different community organisations are getting together, and hospices and others are very much part of that process.
Fantastic. Thank you. I'm going to draw a line. Thank you so much, everybody, for all the questions that you've been putting through. Really hugely varied and much appreciated. And of course, to say a huge thanks to our panel members. I think, you know, I kind of like making notes as we go and listening and thinking about these things. And it's very easy to say, it's incredibly hard to do. So, you know, our congratulations really to say very impressive work. I think hospices have a huge amount to offer more widely to the leadership and the governance of the health and care system. And I think where you can, embracing that broader responsibility can and does open doors. And the more visible you are in your local system, the more impact you're going to have, I think, for your hospice. And of course, importantly, your local population. So trust, hard work, process, keeping the why central. That's going to be one thing that I definitely walk away with, is that total laser-like focus on why you're coming together and making sure that you come back to that. Thank you for giving us those insights. It was a real pleasure to hear your presentations and your discussions today. Thank you. So could we show our thanks?